This video is part one of a two-part series. Japanese culture. What comes to mind when I say that phrase, dear viewer? Now I know what you might be thinking. Affordable and reliable automobiles? No? Could it be anime, sushi, samurai, an obsession for neckbeards and other such sweaty basement dwellers alike? Weebs, Goku, vending machines for used panties? Well, I mean, these are simply stereotypes. But what if I were to be the first one to tell you that this is but the tip of the pagoda? Well, I mean, I'm probably not, but bear with me on this one. Regardless of what might come to mind, one thing can be unanimously agreed upon. Japanese culture is a foreign one, almost otherworldly in some certain aspects, especially to the point of view of Westerners like myself. For example, here's one take on Japanese culture. Both aggressive and unaggressive, both militaristic and aesthetic, both insolent and polite, rigid and adaptable, submissive and resentful of being pushed around, loyal and treacherous, brave and timid, conservative and yet hospitable to new ways. This passage describing post-World War II Japanese culture was written by Dr. Ruth Benedict in her anthropological study, The Chrysanthemum and the Sword. But what is the Chrysanthemum and the Sword? Well, dear viewer, I'm sure glad you asked. I'm your favorite armchair philosopher, Mr. Minarchist. So stick around, get cozy, and let me tell you all about the Chrysanthemum and the Sword. Pre-war Japan was a vastly different place, with a set of values that were even more different than the Japan we all know and love today. It was an incredibly nationalistic country, and when the United States had declared war on the Empire of Japan, it set in motion one of the most brutal and hard-fought conflicts in human history. Never before had we encountered an enemy on the battlefield that refused to surrender, or that was seemingly unafraid of death. In fact, the Japanese troops seemed to welcome the prospect of dying with honor. This was received by the United States with pure confusion and frustration in equal measure, as how could one be expected to combat an enemy when one can't even comprehend the enemy's motivations? This would be the point in which Dr. Ruth Benedict entered the scene, as it was now her job to solve the various puzzles Japanese society had posed to the West. And it would be her findings that influenced U.S. policy regarding a defeated Japan at the war's close. She shares her initial thoughts on her mission in the book, writing, "The Japanese were the most alien enemy the United States had ever fought in an all-out struggle. In no other war with a major foe had it been necessary to take into account such exceedingly different habits of acting and thinking." Although Benedict would complete her work in 1946, a year after the war, she had actually begun conducting the study back in 1944. It was not an easy task, as she would put it, an anthropologist's greatest tool is a field trip. And this was obviously impossible. So she found the next best thing, interviewing the Nisei. Nisei, literally translated from Japanese, means second generation, and is used in reference to Japanese immigrants born outside of Japan, particularly in the United States, especially the Pacific states and the territory of Hawaii at that time. Many of these Nisei were incarcerated in internment camps by order of President Roosevelt for fear that they would undermine the American war effort. But to Benedict's surprise, they were incredibly helpful and would become instrumental in making the Japanese mindset that much clearer. The Nisei offered an analysis of their very own, as they had found themselves in a bit of an uncomfortable spot. Their families had left the rigidity of Japanese society in pursuit of freedom, only to be corralled into camps as if they were propagating the aims of the Japanese Empire, and that they could possibly be our foe, and that they weren't to be trusted. Dr. Benedict initially approached Japan as a nation of contradictions, but the Nisei enlightened her, as the very setting of the internment camp went on to prove that we Americans were also in a nation of contradictions. Perhaps not comprised of the same contradictions as Japan, but it still went on to show that rarely, if ever, is any story black and white. I know, what a novel concept, but mind you, this was the middle of the 20th century, and yes, despite being only 80 years ago, it was still a much different time than you or I could possibly imagine. But despite the differences and similarities between Japan and America, some of which still persist to this day, and the contradictions of our societies, then why are we so drastically different? Well, we'll have to delve into the anthropological theories that Ruth proposes, that of the guilt culture versus the shame culture. Now, the differences between our two societies is why the Chrysanthemum and the Sword was written, but what new idea does it really establish? In the academic discipline, otherwise known as cultural anthropology, the theory of there being a distinction between how social control is exerted over society is called the guilt-shame-fear spectrum. Dr. Ruth Benedict popularized this terminology in the Chrysanthemum and the Sword. This form of societal control or acceptance appears in how a society approaches things like law, business, or what is perceived as acceptable social etiquette. In The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, Benedict categorizes the United States, and most of Europe for that matter, as having a guilt culture, that is, a culture which forms the undertones of a society's worldview. She uses Western religious practices, i.e. Christianity, as an example, in that a society with guilt culture expects punishment for wrongdoing, either in this life or the next. In a guilt culture, one might philosophically ponder the question of, is my behavior fair or unfair? And if it is unfair, how might that be punished? Alternatively, Benedict then goes on to categorize Japan, and most of Asia for that matter, as being a shame culture, in which the means of societal control are found in how shameful or dishonorable an act may be considered. The way in which this type of culture splinters off from our own Western guilt culture is that a punishment for a wrongful act falls upon oneself to carry out. In a shame culture, one might ponder, if I do this, will I be ashamed? Or, alternatively, does my behavior make my family ashamed of me? The consequences of both guilt and shame-based cultures come in the form of both benefits and detriments. For example, Japan as a nation is prided on its economic efficiency, with a business culture unlike any other, with several posts on social media often sharing the fun fact that sleeping at one's post in Japan is acceptable, as it is seen as a result of hard work, and that some workers even pretend to fall asleep when their boss approached to curry favor. However, this is symptomatic of a somewhat overbearing business culture, complete with long, unforgiving hours and high-stress environments. It is considered shameful not to accept overtime, and honorable to stay with one corporation for the complete duration of one's career. There is even a term in Japanese, karoshi, which translates to English as overwork death, with some cases of 29-year-old individuals dying from strokes after regularly working 12-hour shifts. And that's simply the approach to business in a shame-based culture, as the approach to the law is best surmised by the Confucian teaching, lead the people with law, and organize them with punishments, and they will avoid the punishments but be without a sense of shame. Lead them with virtue, and organize them with ritual, and in addition to developing a sense of shame, they will bring order to themselves. And this approach seems quite viable when carried out in the effort to create a peaceful and homogeneous society. But it leaves little in the form of individuality, as this organization is now enforced by threat of ostracization, and creates a society in which those live are fixated on appearance and how they present themselves, or, simply put, the opinions of others. Which brings us to a shame culture's approach to social etiquette, as Japan isn't really considered a very socially liberated nation. For example, it is not considered inherently shameful for women to be right up there with the men in the workforce. However, it is for mothers. Additionally, sexuality is also quite a slippery slope, as for both men and women, timidness and virginity are seen as attractive traits, but both of these contribute to Japan's ongoing population crisis, as well as a stunted development in individual sexuality that the West often attributes to a simple sexual perversion in Japanese society. And while chikan, a Japanese word that denotes unwanted advances of a sexual nature, isn't considered inherently shameful, it is when you are the victim of such advances. It is perhaps the Japanese definition of what is and isn't shameful that confuses Westerners, but that is merely one of the many aspects that make Japan a mysterious nation to us. But Westerners are typically enthralled with the brighter aspects of Japanese culture, rather than the ones I've just mentioned, as it is their thrilling historical legends of samurai and ninjas that are just as appealing as their absurdist brand of humor. As well as their over-the-top animations. And these are but two of the aspects that make Westerners so mesmerized and thus either unable or unwilling to bring their attentions to the more dysfunctional aspects of Japan. These charming aspects serve as the backdrop to the less savory parts of the society. Just as with any society or culture really, there are pros and cons everywhere. And speaking of that surreal mythos that surrounds Japanese society, it's essential to address how the concept of honor factors into shame culture. And while all of Asia is considered to operate within the confines of shame culture, Japan goes that extra mile with how the culture of one's honor correlates within it, which it could be argued factors into a big problem that Japanese society has always faced. Suicide rates in Japan have always been comparatively high when used an example to their neighbors or other nations, and there are various reasons for this, as with rates in other countries. Throughout Japanese history, particularly before 1945, when honor culture was governed by, and the primary code in which one lived their life was, Bushido. Within the earliest instances of shame culture's coalescence within Japanese society, it was an accepted idea that after shaming oneself to the highest degree, there would only be one way in which to salvage what remained of one's honor, and thus, by extension, one's dignity. Ritualistic suicide. After Japan's rapid modernization after the Meiji Restoration, and again after the fall of the Japanese Empire in World War II, that doesn't mean that this method of salvaging one's dignity simply disappeared as a result of this modernization. It merely became more subtle. In Japan, it could be argued that the culture's pursuit of perfection, and thusly honor, is to blame for many of the suicides in Japan today. It isn't a far reach, at least. Even though your average citizen probably wouldn't commit seppuku like a samurai would to preserve their honor and dignity. But it isn't all too uncommon for families to outright disown those who have made them ashamed to the point of no return in the modern day. Like most Western cultures, Japanese people might turn to a life of vice after a fall from grace, or just plain hit rock bottom. Or some might live as a shut-in and leave their homes for a new start. But this all depends on how far one has fallen, and if they were a highly respected individual in their field, then we might see them doing the unthinkable. Well, I think that's about all we have time for when it comes down to part 1. But in part 2, we'll look through Western society's own guilt culture in relation to shame culture, as well as how the theory was further presented in The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, and finally, how the Chrysanthemum and the Sword was received, as with any research, there are of course those who would agree and disagree. Either way, tune in next time and tell me what you think so far about the ideas surrounding the Chrysanthemum and the Sword down in the comments below. I've been Mr. Minarchist. Keep your heads on a swivel out there. It's a big, big world.